All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this final of this fantastic experience that we've had over the last couple of days of learning together on Chol Hamoed. Our final speaker for the program is Rabbi Yitzchok Adlerstein, who is the Director of Interfaith Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the global Jewish human rights organization. He has an exceptional and very impressive bio, which I'm not going to read, but just to note that he is quite a prolific writer and author, and he's just released a book quite recently, I think in the last week or so, Rabbi Adlerstein. It's just
a few weeks.
I saw it come on my Korean email last week, quite fortuitously. It's an absolute pleasure to have him. Thank you so much, and I will hand over to Rabbi Adlerstein.
Thank you so much. Moadim l'simcha, guten Moed to everybody, and double thanks to Rabbi Krebs, first of all, for inviting me to this remarkable gathering, one of the many hidden blessings of this calamity that we face together. And added to that is another thank you to him for when I submitted a list of possible topics and said my preference, frankly, would be to do pure Torah. No entertainment, just content, just to share the beauty of Torah. I usually get called upon to do the other, but welcome any opportunity to be able to share just words of Torah. I'm giving this shiur le'ilui nishmas. My mother, Hareini Kaparas Mishkava, Peril Bas Yitzchok, who passed away just a little bit more than 4 weeks ago. I just came out of Shloshim. I'll beg your indulgence if I wind up coughing too much. I am battling the accursed virus, Baruch Hashem. I feel a lot better in the last couple of days. And I don't think that hydroxychloroquine can hold a candle to the therapeutic effects of sharing Torah with Klal Yisrael. I will gladly stay on past my limit. If you have any questions, I think there's a chat feature where you can signal that you want to talk afterwards. But I will try to not go beyond the expiration of the clock. For all I know, the Zoom meeting may itself come to an end. Okay, let's get right into it. The Gemara Yerushalmi, the end of Psachim, asks why, if there is a mitzvah, indeed a commandment, for Jews to sing Shira, to sing the praises of Hashem at a time of monumental salvation, why did they not sing it the night of the 15th, the night of their actual liberation? And the Yerushalmi says cryptically that leaving Egypt was only the beginning of the Geula, only the beginning of the redemption. The end of the redemption was on the 7th day. The 7th day is a little bit of an anomaly. I suspect that many people listening in know the Ramban, Nachmanides, and Chumash, who says that just as there is an 8th day to the holiday of Sukkot, there is an 8th day to Pesach. But it's not next Thursday, or this Thursday. The 8th day is actually 7 times 7 plus 1, and it's the holiday of Shavuos. So that makes the 7th day of Pesach even more of an orphan. It's not the real conclusion of the holiday. Yet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, treat it as a holiday. What is the specialness? Why is this the end of Geula? Why is it that less than a week ago, we sat at the Seder table and 3 different opinions as to how many more miracles took place at the splitting of the sea than took place at the time they left Egypt. The 7th day, of course, is the day that they crossed the Reed Sea. So what we're going to do, if I can speak pretty quickly and don't cough too much, is go through a list of briefer items culled from much of the literature, of the deeper literature available to us, plus a piece by the Slonim Rebbe, Nesiva Shalom, and the grand finale will be an absolutely gorgeous treatment of a Gemara that you'll think has nothing to do with the seventh day, but yet the Maral uses to define the essence of the crossing of the Reed Sea. So here we go. The first part, a list of brief items to show what is so special about the seventh day, what it was that made the crossing of the Reed Sea so different from 6 months to a year's worth of witnessing miraculous events, the 10 plagues, stuff that movie blockbusters are made of, Cecil B. DeMille's not even being the first or the last, and yet somehow, according to the Haggadah that we read, the crossing of the Reed Sea on the seventh day of Pesach outstripped it in its magnificence. One, what Jews saw at the crossing of the sea was hashgacha pratit. They saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu's providence focused on individuals. We know that from Rashi, quoting the Gemara, that there are 3 different descriptions of the deaths of the Egyptians who pursued them into the sea. Some sunk very quickly, others not so quickly, and others were tossed to and fro to die a slower death. And Chazal say that each Egyptian who died in a way that was commensurate with the evil that he had committed in his lifetime. The Jewish people saw that not only did HaKadosh Baruch Hu care for the nation, not only did he pull out all stops to rescue people, but he was concerned with the lives of individuals, both the good and the evil, that ultimately there is justice in this world. We see it very, very rarely, but they did see that at the sea. A variation of this is that the Vilna Gaon calls the Yad HaChazaka, that the Torah says was in evidence at the crossing of the sea, with Onesh HaGadol. This may mean the great punishment. It may mean that all the previous plagues could be seen by people as instrumental. They were needed to bring the Egyptians to their knees and get them to finally send out the Jews. But that was not the case over here. What they saw here was not an instrumentality, but they saw a display of something very fearful indeed. The Yad HaChazaka, Midas Hadin, the attribute of divine justice. A further variation on that variation comes from one of my mentors in Rabbeim, Rav Moshe Eisenman Shlita, who says that Hashem's finger, which the Khartoumim, the sorcerers, said in reaction to one plague, this is the finger of God. A finger points out a fault. And indeed, the 10 plagues pointed out the guilt of the Egyptians. A hand, however, doesn't point out a fault. It squeezes and crushes a useless encumbrance. In Egypt, in other words, the Egyptians were punished for what they did to others. The finger pointed to them and their guilt. At the sea, they were punished and reduced to nothingness for the crime they had committed against themselves, for what they had become in the process. Another approach, the Or Yecheskel. He points to the fact that the Shira, the Song of the Sea, practically begins with a reference to Egyptian horses and riders. Is this the key focus of what happened here? Why does Shira start with Susuroch Vo Rama Vayam? Horses, we know, were the pride of Egypt, literally and symbolically. And says the Or Yecheskel, pride, even pride in other people, interferes with the recognition of Hashem. I don't think anybody put it better than John Wayne. I know I'm dating myself, in a cowboy movie whose name I forgot, but it was one of the classic John Wayne lines. This town ain't big enough for the both of us. That is ga'ava. That is what pride does to a recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Gemara, John Wayne obviously paraphrased the Gemara, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at ga'ava, at pride, he says there is not room enough in the world for both of us. Another approach, the classic Lehman Haggadah, one of the first Haggadahs in a printed as a vernacular translation. This goes back to 19th century Germany, still a classic today. He says that what was great about the crossing of the Red Sea on the seventh day was Bizas Hayam. Chazal say that Klal Yisrael enriched themselves enormously. They had not done so poorly for themselves on the last days before leaving Egypt, but it was incomparably outdone by what they managed to strip from the pursuing chariots and soldiers who met their doom at the sea. Why was this so important? Money in the bank, they could hardly use any of it in the next 40 years. Says Rabbi Marcus Lehman that this would be a hint of what would happen in the future. There was no way of repaying people for the suffering for 210 years. That's not what Bizas Hayam was about. There was no way that the Germans could make reparations to the Jewish people after the Holocaust. But, as a token, it's still important. Klal Yisrael got a message through Bizas Hayam, through the spoils of the sea, that there's an accounting and there is a justice, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu noted their suffering and was going to give them something for their pain. In this lifetime, none of us ever see how the pieces fit in, but it is important to know that that is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at communities and individuals. There would be a need to deal with the evil, to deal with the individual suffering, and to justify it. Another approach, this one is probably the most obvious. We repeat it so often. Ra'asa shifcha al hayam, a common handmaiden, saw spiritual vistas open up at the sea that even the great prophet Yecheskel didn't see. They learned a lot rationally about God in the 10 plagues. As a matter of fact, I hope that you stopped to note during your Seder that the famous acronym, Ditzach, Adash, and Bachav, is not just a mnemonic for remembering the names of the 10 plagues, but it actually subdivides the plagues into 3 parts, each section resulting in a different rational understanding of who God is. In medieval times, they called it Mitzius, Hashgacha, and Yecholis. The existence of God. By the end of the 3rd plague, the sorcerers had to say, this is not magic, this is not theurgy, this is the work of a God who's bigger than us. The 2nd set, Adash, showed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu dealt differently with good and evil, with good people and evil people, separating in remarkable fashion between Jews and their guilty neighbors. And the final ones, Bachav, showed the full extent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God, to treat natural law, which he himself created, as his plaything that could be overridden at any time and different laws substituted for it. The spiritual vistas at the Yam were nothing like that. There they understood not just rationally, but meta-rationally. They were treated to an experience of closeness, prophetic closeness with God, that allowed them to understand what the rational mind alone cannot do. Another approach, Rav David Cohen in Flatbush, prolific writer, tremendous Talmid Chacham. The angels in heaven, according to Chazal, said, flag down on the play. I'm sorry for the reference to United States football. Flag down on the play. I don't get it. Why are you splitting? We don't get it. Why are you splitting the sea for these people rather than the other people? They're both idolaters. Ma'ishna elu mi elu. We're going to skip the response right now. But Rav David Cohn says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted there to be a geula, a redemption that was enmeshed in difficulty and in questions. That there is the possibility of geula at a time when the angels will say, wait a second, God, this is not in the playbook. This is not the way it's supposed to happen. These people do not deserve it. They did deserve to be liberated from Egypt. And they did have mitzvahs recommending themselves. And they did have excuses for being the idolaters. But when they got to the edge of the sea and they split up into different factions, some of them stoning the others, at that point the angel said, why are these people better than the Egyptians? And God silenced them. And so it will be in the future. There is the possibility of redemption even in a time when heavenly onlookers will say that they don't really deserve it. Next, the Sfas Emes. Sfas Emes says that by Hashem's rules, his chesed could only begin the process of redemption. As the Yerushalmi we started off with says, the end of redemption took place 7 days later, but that required man's avoda. The end of the geula, meaning the extinguishing the source of the suffering, not just the suffering itself, that required man's input. At the sea, Klal Yisrael had different options. Some said, let's wage war, let's return to Egypt, let's jump in, let's make a lot of noise and hope we'll scare them off. One option was the correct option. And some people, led by Nachshon ben Aminadav, jumped in, sacrificing, as far as they knew, any logical sense of where the redemption was going to come from, and saying, if we're going to live, it'll only be because we throw ourselves upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu entirely. Those people led the way. Even those who had exercised or opted for the wrong choice followed, and that participation by the people led to the redemption, the fuller redemption of the entire people. Another one from the Sfas Emes is the lessons of Shira itself, of the song that they sang at the end. Barely a few moments before, there were people cynically, Jews have been cynics from day one. Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch says, Baruch Hashem, we're cynics. No one should be able to say that God sold the Brooklyn Bridge. God foisted some crazy idea upon them, and because they were naive and uncritical, they accepted it. Jews grumbled from day one, and they grumbled here too, when they turned to Moshe and they said, why have you brought us here? Are there no graves in Egypt? Those same people, the hardcore cynics, were able to sing Shira in unison with everybody else in the people. And what a miracle that was, that people from all different kinds of levels were able to sing the exact same words that ultimately became timeless Torah itself. How could that be? The Sfas Emes points to the Rashi, Oz Yashir Moshe. Grammatically, that means then Moshe will sing. Rashi's approach, Oz Yashir, then it dawned upon Moshe. Moshe decided that he would sing. Why is that the way the Torah expresses itself? Says the Sfas Emes, because everything depends on Ratzon, on the will. The people willed it, that they wanted to unburden their hearts with the gratitude that they now felt for everything they knew about Hashem and Hashem had done for them. That willingness, that resolve gave them the ability to do quantum jumps in level. That's the beauty of the Shira. that people from the lower echelons of spirituality of the people were able to jump levels, something we normally do not advise, but knowing that that capacity is there, the entire people was united in the ability to sing Shira. That tells us something both about the power of resolve and the power of the klal, of the many. We move now to the second section, the Nesiva Shalom, the Slonim Rebbe, who has a number of absolutely beautiful pieces on Pesach. I'm going to share one of them on Shvi Shal Pesach on the seventh day. The Rebbe begins with questions. One of the lines right before, actually the line immediately before the Shira is, Vayar Yisrael es hayad hagadola asher asa Hashem b'Mitzrayim. And Yisrael saw the great hand that Hashem used in Egypt. Vayiru ha'am es Hashem, and the people were in awe of Hashem. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo, and they believed in Hashem and Moshe, his servant. Asks the Slonim Rebbe, this is worse than an anticlimax. They saw the hand and they believed? How could you not believe after witnessing the power of that hand? We think of belief as something that fills in. When we cannot fully see something with perfect clarity, it connects the dots. It allows us to see the bigger pattern. It allows us to see behind some obscurity. There was no obscurity. People saw the hand of Hashem. How is it that there's room left to talk about what they believed in? Besides, was Emunah anything new? Don't our sages tell us that they were redeemed from Egypt because of the Emunah, because of the belief that they kept alive through hundreds of years of subjugation? Says the Rebbe something very beautiful. There are three types of Emunah. There's Emunah with the mind. There's Emunah with the heart. The Balei Musar pointed out a long time ago that the single longest distance on planet Earth is between the mind and the heart. So there's often a big gap between what the mind knows and what the heart truly feels. But there's one other level, and that is Emunah of the body, where the body is so possessed of Emunah that without having to think or emote, the body acts properly, as if programmed by that Emunah. Says the Rebbe, the first two levels of Emunah, in fact, the Jews had when they left Egypt, and it was in that merit. In fact, levels of Emunah are vouchsafed to every Jew. It is part of the constitution of the Jewish neshama. An earlier Rebbe in Slonim, Rav Noach of Luchovitz, would tell someone who complained that he thought his Emunah was faltering, he would thunder at him, "You should believe that you believe. Clouds cover the light of your Emunah and darken your world." In other words, I am guaranteeing you that in the neshama of a Jew is Emunah. It's there. Sometimes it becomes inaccessible. Sometimes it can be stifled so well that a person will never recover it for the rest of his life. But it's there. What happened at the Yam Suf, at the Reed Sea, were some changes in that Emunah. How? The Pasuk says that they saw the dead on the shore. Not one of their pursuers remained. Says the Rebbe, and he's not the first to say this, that the dead does not mean the last pursuing Egyptian soldier. It refers to what in Hasidus is called Klipas Mitzrayim. A klipa is a shell that encases the sparks of Kedusha in this world. There are different forms of evil. Each is a different kind of klipa. Mitzrayim, Egypt, had its own klipa. At the sea, the entire klipa of Mitzrayim died in front of them. Their entire culture, their value system, everything that was attractive for so many decades before to Jews, and that they still had room in their hearts when they left Egypt. Had they not had room in their hearts, there would have been no possibility of pursuing them. It was only because they were still attracted to part of that klipa, perhaps not the worst of it, but enough to hold back their emunah. How did it happen? How was that klipa killed? Because they jumped in, because minds and bodies acted in concert. They moved from emunah of the heart and the mind to emunah sevarim, to emunah of the body as well. Yet another nuance. The Baal Shem Tov said that for all that he has studied and learned, in emunah he is still like a simple child. How could the Baal Shem Tov have room left for further emunah? Isn't emunah only something that people who lack clarity need? Says the Rebbe, emunah is not about what we grasp. Indeed, my opening question was a good question. They saw the hand. What reason was there to still require emunah? It's because there are always levels of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that are remote and uncomprehended. And when we lack emunah, or when there are roadblocks on the way to emunah, we don't get any further. What the pasuk means right before the Shira is that after seeing the Yad Hagdola, after seeing the death of Klipas Mitzrayim, they were able to get to levels of emunah, of understanding things that were still remote to them even after seeing everything that they had seen before. The emunah here is not the emunah that they left Egypt with. There is always room for more emunah because God will always remain beyond our comprehension. The Rebbe goes on to say that the Egyptian klipa had two parts. One was the simple rejection of the existence of the God of Israel or anything like him. That klipa, if in effect, died with makas bechoros. That died with the plague of the firstborn. It may have died during Choshech, actually, because Ramses, the traditional pharaoh at the time, was supposed to be the son of Ra, the sun god. And Choshech was the obliteration of the power of the sun god entirely. In any case, atheism was not a problem for Jews when they left on the 15th day of the month. But there was another part of the klipa of Egypt, and that was their immorality. That was their lifestyle, what they were into, what their entertainment was like, what their lifestyle was like. Chazal say that the sea split because of, Gemara gives you, Midrashim give you 5 or 6 answers, the most famous of which is, it saw Yosef's Aron, basket of Joseph. If there is anybody in our history who stands for the ability to prevail over an attractive immorality in the surround, it was Yosef who managed to turn down the seduction of Potiphar's wife. The sea split in the merit of Yosef, who was able to prevail over that immorality, as now the Jews would be expected to do themselves. They saw the hand at the right moment. They saw the hand at the right moment when that hand crushed the Egyptians physically. But that's not enough. True emunah is limited by any limitation in Kedusha. This is a little bit of a conundrum. The Rebbe writes about it in several places. The amount of Amunah that you can have is limited by any failing in Kedusha. But how do you get yourself to a higher level of Kedusha without an injection of more Amunah? Somehow, the two of them are in a reciprocal, or rather in a complementary relationship, where each one feeds the other. More Kedusha means more Amunah. More Amunah means more possibility of Kedusha. But it was not until the Klipa of Egypt, the second part, the part that deals with immorality, when that Klipa was fully dead in front of them, that their Amunah could mature. So in fact, there were two stages. There was the great hand killing the Egyptians that got rid of the first part of Klipas Mitzrayim entirely. And then when the second half was fully dead in front of them, Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo. Okay. Here is the grand finale. A remarkable story from the Gemara that the Maharal uses to make perhaps his single most important point about the nature of the crossing of the sea. This is in Perek Mem Aleph 41 of Gevuras Hashem, and it's the story of Pinchas ben Yair and his donkey. I am sure that there are many people listening in who've heard the story many times of Pinchas ben Yair, who was on the road for the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, of redeeming captives. And he was accompanied by two people, someone who was on his way carrying grain to grind it to bake into matzah for Pesach. Appropriate story for this time of year. And he was accompanied as well by a merchant. We don't know what he was doing. We hope that he wasn't carrying wares from China, but we're not told the nature of his business other than he was a taya, a businessman. And Pinchas ben Yair comes to a river. River had a name, Ganoi. And there was no bridge and there was no ferry. And it was too deep and too wide to ford. So what choice did he have? Again, most of you know the end of the story, having to do with Pinchas ben Yair's donkey, who was the first glatt kosher donkey known in recorded history. He was very, very, very frum and refused to eat food from which maaser had not been taken. People often overlook the first part of the story. Maybe, excuse me, because it sounds even more remarkable. They get to the river. Pinchas ben Yair says, hey, I got to get to the other side. Talks to the river and says, river, do me a favor. Part. Open a way for me to walk through. The river kind of says, let me hear that again. And Pinchas ben Yair says, yeah, I got to get to the other side. There's no bridge, there's no ferry. So, what are you waiting for? I'm Pinchas ben Yair. Move out of the way. So the river says, hey, listen, I don't mind. I don't really relish the thought of being a little presumptuous. You are a great Talmid Chacham. But, get real, man. Who's talking over here? So you're mortal flesh, and you think you're a big guy and you can call the shots because you're an important guy and you got connections with above. You know what? What do you think I am? Chopped liver? Both of us serve a function in this world. We're here to do God's will. Let me tell you something, Pinchas. I don't know what odds Jimmy the Greek in Vegas would give on the success of your mission. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. You won't be the first one to succeed in history. You won't be the first one to fall flat on your face. Me, it's a no-starter, no-brainer. What I'm supposed to do, I do, and there's no second guessing it. What makes you any better than me? I'm certain to succeed in what Hashem created, and you're not. So why should I possibly listen to you and change my nature because of some perceived need on your part? Pinchas, nonplussed, glowers back at him and says, listen, I don't negotiate with terrorists and I don't negotiate with rivers. You part from me or I will dry you up like Moshe did to the Reed Sea. The river got the message, opened up a dry path for Pinchas to walk through, and Pinchas makes it to the other side, and the river is ready to resume its course, and Pinchas says, hey, not so fast. What about my buddy over here? You know, the guy who's about to grind matzah for Pesach? I'm not going without him. You opened for me, you got to stay open for him as well. Okay, he walks through. River is about ready to resume its previous behavior, and Pinchas says, wait a second. That's not going to work. I know this guy is not about to grind matzah. He's just a businessman going about making a living, but he's a companion of mine. And if he's traveling with me, it's the three of us together. We're not doing this solo. You stayed open for me and for the matzah man, you're staying open for him as well. And so it was. The Maharal says in this story, we have the essence of what really happened and the grandeur of the splitting of the sea and what it really represents. Here's how he deals with it. Says, first, we have to understand that man exists both as microcosm and macrocosm. What is true of humanity as a whole found in the individual psychic life, of his inner life. He says that there are parts of us, often the only parts of us that are recognized, that are material and physical and just want to be at one with nature and part of the greater ecosystem, and recognize that we're just one small bit of biological activity trying to live, usually not doing a very good job of it, in a neighborhood shared with many, many, many other species. But we're physical. That's it. Of course, Torah Jews can't believe that. Any person whose spiritual eyes are open, Jewish or not, cannot believe that. And we realize that there are other parts of ourselves that can't be immediately engaged by science or by scientific method. Those elements of ourselves, the Maharal says, exist beyond the material, and there are three kinds of those elements. The highest form, sorry for being a Litvak, which the Maharal actually was not, but he says the highest form, I think he's being more a Maimonidean rationalist here, is reason. The ability of man to ponder, to think inductively, deductively, to be able to expose, to understand new truths. The second part, I'm going to get flack from the men. Women know about this, men rarely recognize it, is called the nefesh, which the Maharal says is the emotional. It's the part of ourselves that engages lots of things with a particular kind of enthusiasm, passion, energy. It's particularly valuable in connecting with God in a different way. It's the language of the heart often. This is also something that exists beyond the material in man. And he says there's another part of the nefesh, which is not so ethereal and not so spiritual, but he says cannot be relegated to the purely physical. And that is the part of man that tries to act as a builder of the world, to do things constructively, to make a mark on his surroundings. That is not purely physical, he says, because we see that it is governed by free choice, that people make decisions about it. And anything for which there is an exercise of free choice cannot be purely physical. Says the Maral that in this story, Pinchas, the matzah grinder, and the businessman represent these three planes. Pinchas ben Yair lived on the highest plane. His life was one of exposing new truths through the power of his mind. He parted the veils from what is hidden. He released light from darkness. There's good reason why we call him Pinchas ben Yair, Yair, that which gives life. How did he get there? We would say he got there because he was a tremendous genius, and he spent a lot of time learning in Kollel. Undoubtedly, that was a very great part of it. But the Maral says you need more than that. To make it to that level of rational penetration, of using the power of reason on its highest level, you have to act on it as well. You have to specialize in mitzvos that accomplish something similarly, like releasing captives. The captive sits in darkness, in despair, in not knowing whether this day will be the last of his life, having no freedom, no hope, and the podeh of Shvuyim, the one who releases the captive, takes something out of darkness and to light. That was Pinchas ben Yair. The matzah baker represents the second level, that of connecting with God emotionally. He did this through a mitzvah. He was on his way to participate in the mitzvah of baking matzah for Pesach. Mitzvahs are not primarily rational experiences. They're experiential experiences. Sorry for the rather inept phrase. They are experiential, and they connect us emotionally with the lawgiver. And finally, there was the businessman. Not everybody acts as the one with penetrating reason or with sublime emotional connection, but they help everybody else. They make their contribution in society to building a better or stable world. That was the businessman. The point of the story is that often people on any one of those three levels, or a mixture of them, or climbing from one to the other, meet up with a river. A river is composed of water and water alone. Water is a symbol, among other things, of formlessness and void. It is the state of matter that has no design, no framework, no mold imposed upon it. It is the best example of the purely material. The world came into being by a landmass to serve man, pushing its way up, thrusting up from the formlessness, from the chaos of water of the sea. Water is pure chomer, unmediated and undifferentiated. And this is the punchline of the story. When tsura is the word for form. Some of you are at this point saying, wait a second, this sounds like the old Greek stuff I heard in first year college of matter and form. It is and it isn't. The Maral uses it in a very, very different way than we generally use it in the Western world, and the Greeks in fact used it. But the point is that you can look at the world and separate things into different compartments. One useful way is to look at many relationships as both the substance of what the thing is about and that which shapes it, which gives it form, which gives it purpose, which gives it what we call telos. Pinchas ben Yair was shown that the three parts of man that stand above and apart from Chomer ultimately win, ultimately have more power than Chomer, than the physical itself. And this is exactly what happened at the Yam Suf. This is a very profound lesson and a very important one. Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, were shown that when they stood at the edge of that great sea and stared down at it and had no idea what would happen next, Chomer itself, water, according to Chazal, all the waters of the world parted at that point, not just to advertise the miracle, but to make the point that just as mankind was the tzura of the world, and that's what happened in the 7 days of creation, that the landmass would rise above the sea, so too Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, for the rest of history until the coming of Mashiach, would be the tzura, the form giver, the people pointing in the right direction, the people shaping the progress of humanity to get it to the final goal. And when there is a showdown, a confrontation between material and natural and the tzura, it is the material and natural that give way to them. What a message about the Jewish future, about the mission of the Jewish people to the rest of the world, about what would happen in the course of history through all the irregularities, through all the travail and all the problems, that in the end, we must know that history is guided by tzura, not by chomer, and that Klal Yisrael represents the ability of tzura to prevail, not just the ability, but the fact that tzura will prevail over chomer. Let me end with just a little bit of coming down from this beautiful spiritual plane. The previous Bostoner Rebbe says that, echoing what we said before, that the greatness of crossing the sea was bizas hayam, was what they managed to collect physically, materially, from the Egyptian army that lay in ruins in front of them. The Rebbe asks the question, they were rich already when they left Egypt. What was so great about a few more trinkets, a few more kilo of gold for that matter? And would they have any opportunity to use it for the next 40 years? Says the Rebbe, the word bizas, spoils of the sea, biza is related to the word bizayon. Bizayon means to disparage, something disparaged. That what they saw at the Reed Sea, after collecting all of those goods, they looked at each other and said, do we really need this? Is this what life is about? We thought when we were a slave, sort of like the guy on the roof, if I were a rich man. We are rich, and it means nothing. They were able to look at their riches and be mavaza it, to say it's nice to have. Maybe we'll be able to trade some of it for materials we need in building a mishkan. Maybe we'll pass it along to our children and grandchildren. But it doesn't really matter. It matters in the short run, but far more important than anything that we were able to gain physically here is what we were just able to experience spiritually. We are all kind of living in that kind of bubble right now, with uncertainty, with great losses around us, especially in the United States. At the same time, we've been witness in the last couple of weeks to remarkable spiritual gains. Families that have come together, people who are learning more Torah, people who for the first time made Pesach rather than go and visit friends or go to a hotel. The gains have been remarkable. And we've been able to look at some of the material things of our lives with a little bit of a disparagement. one last remark from the Maharal in a different parak. Maharal says, and I quote, "There had never been such a day when all Jews faced a single calamity at one time." He means as the time that they stood on the banks of the Reed Sea. He continues, "There is no question that at such a time, Hashem remembers to their merit Akedas Yitzchok, the merit of the attempted binding of Isaac and the attempted sacrifice by Abraham." The Maharal means that an existential threat to the entire Jewish people at one time is treated differently in heaven than threats that arise at different times and places. Those threats show the oscillation in history of Hashem between Midas Hadin and Midas Harachamim, attributes of judgment and compassion. Ironically, when there's a threat to the entire people at the same time, we might think it is far more serious, and it is far more hopeless, and it's not, because a threat that strikes the entire Jewish people at one time strikes at the entire covenantal relationship with the Jewish people, going back to Hashem's promise to Avram Avinu. We, in such a situation, ironically, are entitled to look at it with greater reassurance than calamities that are localized in time or place, which Rahman al-Islam do occur. When everyone is faced with the same kind of terror at one time, we can bank on HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembering the schus avos, the merit of our forefathers, and requiring in din, by his law of keeping his promise and his covenant, that there will be a Yeshua around the bend. A good Moed, Moedim L'Simcha, and a good Yontif. I'm going to stay on for a couple of minutes. I noticed there were some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabbi Adlerstein. I really appreciate that. And thank you, everybody. I think people should be able to unmute themselves. I did have some problems in the last time I did this where people couldn't unmute themselves. Give me a sec. Can someone try and mute themselves? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everyone. Hopefully it won't be too much background noise for everyone. So let's see how it goes. Everyone is unmuted. If anyone would like to ask a question, speak up. Anyone?